Hello, and welcome to my presentation on navigating the Freedmen's Bureau records. Now, as you probably already know, African American research can be quite challenging given our history in this country and a legacy rooted in the institution of slavery. Anyone familiar with this type of research knows that there comes a point in your research, particularly in the United States Census records, where you hit what is known as the 1870 brick wall. Now, why is that, and what do you mean by that? Well, because the U.S. population census is taken at the beginning of every decennial dating back to 1790, and in 1870, all African Americans were enumerated on the free inhabitants schedule for the first time in American history, and that was due to the fact that the Civil War ended in 1865. Prior to that time, they were not considered citizens, but slaves, property of free inhabitants that were United States citizens. So that means there was a 5-year gap of minimal documentary evidence of their whereabouts, livelihoods, associations, life events, etc. Prior to 1865, enslaved people can be found in estate records such as probates, court records, deed books, conveyance records, last wills and testaments, and so forth. But that research is beyond the scope of this presentation. Incidentally, searching those records is nearly impossible if you don't have a former slave owner's name. The impact of the Freedmen's Bureau record is that it helps bridge that 5-year gap between 1865 and 1874 by providing clues to not only finding these newly freed people, but their relatives and potential former slave owners, which can lead your research into the estate records that I mentioned earlier and take you on a gut-wrenching yet breathtaking genealogical journey. So let's find out what these Freedmen's Bureau records are all about. So the official name of the Freedmen's Bureau was known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which was established by Congress and became a part of the War Department on March 3, 1865. The term refugees did not just apply to former slaves or people of African descent. It also referred to poor or displaced whites impacted by the atrocities of war. So understand that the Bureau's purpose was to provide relief to the South. You could say it was the original FEMA, so to speak. Over 4 million formerly enslaved people documented along with former slave owners. And then there was also oversight that involved all 15 southern states, including the District of Columbia. The organization of the Bureau starts with a commissioner at the top of the chain, appointed by the president. Abraham Lincoln had appointed Union General Oliver Otis Howard as head of the Bureau, who fiercely advocated for Congress to appropriate funds for schools. 2 years later, Howard founded the historically black college, Howard University, which was named in his honor. The Bureau also consisted of assistant commissioners who issued reports and summaries on labor and land issues, legal issues, school reports, and problems in the communities. A lot of that information is reported to them from their subordinates in the field offices in the form of telegrams and letters, but they will also receive issuances, which would be general and special orders, from Washington. Now, the field office records, that's where you're going to spend the bulk of your time, because the field officers were the ones who were at ground zero. They were the ones developing relationships with the members of the communities. They would also provide summaries and reports as well on conditions such as the condition of the destitute, educational services such as schools, labor contracts, abandoned and confiscated lands, and murders and violence, and any type of unrest in the community. Because of their direct interaction with inhabitants, many of these documents will mention individuals by name. So you definitely want to pay close attention to these records. So yes, understand that the Bureau was responsible for providing food, clothing, health care, education, legalizing marriages, establishing labor contracts, schools, and help freedmen acquire some of the abandoned or confiscated land after the war. Additionally, they would investigate and report incidents of racial confrontations, lynchings, murders, and sexual assaults. They also helped the individuals file claims against the accused for not only the aforementioned crimes, but also against former slave owners who refused to pay wages once a labor contract was established between both parties. So the Freedmen's Bureau inevitably failed to accomplish many of its objectives, and there were several reasons for that. So where do I start? Well, President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, succeeded President Lincoln, who was assassinated in 1865. He was a Confederate sympathizer who did everything that he could to undermine Congress and the Bureau. Johnson favored rapid restoration and protections for the seceded states, but not former slaves. He supported states' rights and considered suffrage as a state issue and not a federal issue. He pardoned many former Confederates and restored their land to them, eliminating the possibility for many blacks to be landowners. He also removed many Bureau employees he felt were too sympathetic to the freedmen. And in February of 1866, he vetoed a bill to extend the Bureau's funds, tenure, and increase its power. So as a result, field agents were ridiculed and terrorized by violent whites, including the Klan. Johnson's efforts helped stifle the appropriation of funds from Congress, which prevented the Bureau from really fulfilling its purposes. Southern states enacted laws known as black codes, which helped suppress the legal rights of freedmen. Now let's stop right there and talk about black codes. What are they? Well, black codes are a series of laws and provisions that were established to systematically suppress the rights of newly freed people by compelling them to work in labor economies that were purely based on debt. They also were meant to discourage protests and revolts, control migration and labor. Any violations of these codes could result in you getting arrested for minor infractions, which of course then led to the convict lease system. And some of these laws prohibited just basic constitutional rights, such as the right to assembly, the right to bear arms, the right to exercise free speech, and the right to testify against white people in court. So, as a result of all of these factors, the Bureau had failed to really provide the long-term protections for blacks that they needed. And by 1872, Congress, due in part to the pressure from white Southerners, ended up disbanding the Bureau. So what type of record collections are we talking about in the Freedmen's Bureau? Well, there's hospital and patient records. There's bounty registers and military claimant registers for United States colored troops. There's also labor contracts, apprenticeships, and indentures. So we're talking about the beginning of sharecropping, where these formerly enslaved who worked for free are now working for a living wage, and they're having the federal government intervene to set up those contracts to be paid. There's registers of claimants, and they, as I stated earlier, they could make all kinds of claims on whether it was violence, sexual assaults, or not being paid for work that they had completed. Registers of marriages, ration reports, so if they were received any kind of food or clothing or blankets, those would be reported, as well as land reports on abandoned and confiscated lands, and then also court reports where the names of the defendants would be mentioned in those court reports. And so those would be critical records to look at as well. So let's talk about the keys to success when researching the Freedmen's Bureau records and how to increase the probability that you will find the information that you're looking for. First, you will need to select a person of interest and any possible relatives known to them that lived during that time frame. You'll also need to verify their ages to ensure that they would have lived during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Third, try to pinpoint their locale before and after the Civil War. Now, given that black people weren't enumerated on the census until 1870, I guess the 1870 census then would be a good starting place. It's not a guarantee that that location is where they lived during slavery, but it might point you in the right direction most of the time. If not the location of the enumerated census, try the stated birth or the birth state that the person of interest or their relatives indicated on that 1870 census. It might give you a clue. Were there any boundary changes during this time? Meaning, was that particular territory identified as one place in a certain period of time and then later known by a different name because boundaries had changed? For instance, if your person of interest was enumerated on the Webster Parish, Louisiana census in 1880, You would have to know enough about Webster Parish history that the parish was founded in 1871, 9 years prior. So prior to 1871, that land formerly belonged to Bossier, Claiborne, and Bienville parishes. So there may be a possibility that during slavery and after the Civil War, your person of interest lived in one of those three parishes, resulting in you possibly looking at three different parish record collections. My hope is that you could narrow that down by identifying their whereabouts on that 1870 census to save yourself some time and headache. Now, this next point is the most important and critical key to your success, which is once you find the target locality, you need to use the finding aids available to navigate you through the records. I cannot stress this enough, and I will be emphasizing this throughout the rest of this presentation. And lastly, do you happen to know the most recent slave owner's name and residence? You know, it's rare to have that kind of info if you are a descendant of enslaved ancestors, but if you do, it could be a huge help. So let's talk about one of the tools that's available to you for research in the Freedmen's Bureau records. There's a website called discoverfreedmen.org. It's a website that was developed by the Freedmen's Bureau Project, which involved collaboration among the following entities. First, we have Family Search International. Now, discoverfreedmen.org integrates with familysearch.org and utilizes the same database for records when running search queries. Then we have the National Archives and Records Administration, and this repository in Washington, D.C. has kept the original Freedmen's Bureau records for decades. We also have the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and finally, the California African American Museum. So the purpose of this project was to index names of nearly 1.8 million men, women, and children identified in the Freedmen's Bureau records. And by June of 2016, nearly 19,000 volunteers indexed these records, allowing them to be searchable online. So to give you an example of how this works, here is an 1880 census from Chickasaw, Mississippi, where I researched these two individuals, Marilyn Cooper and his wife Frona, also known as Sophrona. And as you can see here in 1880, Marilyn Cooper was 54 years old, and his wife Frona was around 39 years old. So that means that Marilyn would have been born in 1826 roughly, and Frona would have been born in 1841. Clearly, they would have been young adults during the time of Reconstruction, and they may be documented in Freedmen's Bureau records. So noting that vital information on this couple, I then go to the landing page for discoverfreedmen.org right here and click on this Search Records button. And it'll take me to this page here entitled Discover Your Roots. And as you can see here, I've already typed in Marilyn Cooper's name with the hopes that if his name is indexed in the records, it will pull up results for him. And lo and behold, the very first record shown in Family Search's database is Marilyn Cooper of Mississippi. And it turns out to be a United States Freedmen's Bureau labor contract. You can also see here that the total results shown are 271 for Maryland, but it's only the top result that clearly has his name. The other ones would be very speculative. Okay, so I'm only showing you the second page of this labor contract, and it's a handwritten contract, and it states at the top, in testimony of our agreement to the above contract, we hereunto affix our names or marks in presence of the undersigned subscribing witnesses. And here you see that they list Marilyn Cooper, age 39, and his wife Sophrona, age 24. And if you do the math, this labor contract, which was recorded in Chickasaw County, Mississippi in 1865, well, that would put their birth dates at 1826 and 1841 respectively, which is consistent with the 1880 census that I showed you earlier. So when you have a scenario like this where you can just type in a name in discoverfreedmen.org and get the desired results immediately, well, that seems like a perfect world, right? Well, not so fast, because in my experience in utilizing this tool, I have run name searches for records, that I knew were there, and my results were null. And despite the wonderful efforts of volunteers, not all the names and fields were indexed properly, if at all, unfortunately. Additionally, in some cases, the results are too broad, and that produces hundreds of results, making it hard to decipher which one pertains to your person of interest. In this slide, I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about from my own personal ancestry. Here is an 1870 United States Census in West Feliciana Parish listing my fourth great-grandparents, Nelson Taylor, who's 65, and his wife Litha, who's 58. And I acquired this census record, I think it was around 2005, and since then I've uncovered several pieces of information about them. Like this marriage record, which shows Litha's maiden name is Bryant, and their marriage date, which is November 13th, 1869. Now you might ask, well, how could a couple who's over the age of 55 on the 1870 census get married just a year prior? Well, this could be one of those situations where slave marriages were not formally or legally recognized prior to 1865, and the Freedmen's Bureau could have possibly been responsible for assisting in legalizing their marriage. That I'm not 100% sure on, but what I can tell you is that I ordered a copy of this certificate from the Louisiana State Archives. But also when I visited the West Feliciana Parish Courthouse years later, I saw another copy of this marriage certificate there as well. Now on the very next page of the census, where we saw my fourth great-grandparents, we now here see my third great-grandparents, Nelson Taylor Jr. and his wife, Martha. And Nelson is 33 years old and his wife is 18 at that time. And they too also have a marriage certificate. And interestingly enough, theirs was filed before Nelson's parents. Theirs was filed January 13th, 1869. And you'll also notice that Nelson has the designation FMC after his name, and Martha has FWC, and her maiden name apparently was Morgan. And those designations stand for free man of color and free woman of color. So when I tried to run the query on the name Nelson Taylor as I did for Marilyn Cooper, I got a much different result in Family Search's database. Here you see I have a total of 861 results for a Nelson Taylor, and they come from multiple locations. My person of interest comes from West Feliciana Parish, but as you can see here, this top result, actually the top two results, show you Lafourche Parish, as well as this other one from Edgefield, South Carolina, and other regions of Louisiana. Now this one here close to the bottom, well, it shows Orleans Parish, but in my experience with Louisiana Freedmen's Bureau records, you have to be very careful when you see New Orleans, because that indexed record could be pertaining to the New Orleans field office and not the actual residence of the person. So like I said earlier, not all fields were properly indexed. And just as I cautioned, when you click on it, you see that this record references the New Orleans dispersing officer, which suggests that this was a record stored at the New Orleans field office. Additionally, I have no other context of this record other than there is a person named Harriet Sands, sister of Delaney James, and they're filing a complaint. And here you see this Thomas Savage and Nelson Taylor, who are also named in the complaint. But again, I have no context of who he is, his relationship to these individuals, and where he is located, so there's not much that I can deduce from this. If I continue to scroll down the list of results, I see several more Nelson Taylors from places like Kentucky, but I do see two entries associated with the name Litha Taylor, and of course, that's a huge clue that these records are linked to my third and fourth great grandparents. This particular collection is called the United States Freedmen's Bank Records, so when I click on it, I'm looking at a bank record from the focal point of a woman named Liza Nelson. In this record, she indicates that her parents are Nelson and Litha Taylor, and she also claims to have a brother named Nelson, who I presume would be Nelson Jr., my third great grandfather. But she also lists sisters named Sarah Ann Butler, Frances Irving, and Malvina Wilkerson. Now at the time, these were names that were unknown to me, and you might ask, well, how do you know for sure that these individuals are your family? Well, not only do I know they are from the same area, which is listed as Bayou Sara, and that was a small town in West Feliciana that was destroyed by a flood, but also that bank record provided more insight on the 1870 census. You'll see here that next door to Nelson and Litha is a couple known as John Irvine and Frances Irvine with their children. And then next door to them is a man named William Wilkerson with his wife, Vina Wilkerson, which is Malvina Wilkerson, the same Frances Irvine and Malvina Wilkerson mentioned in the bank record. So I had been looking at this census record for years and had no idea that these two families next door were also my relatives until I saw that bank record. So as we turn the page, you'll see Malvina's children listed at the top, and then a few doors down in yellow and green, you see Nelson Taylor Jr. and his wife Martha and their daughter Eliza. But next door to them on both sides of their home, you see a Richard Stafford and a Wiley Jones. Now, these are two individuals that I have not mentioned at this point, but I want you to make a mental note of these two names because they will be referenced later on in this presentation. Richard Stafford and Wiley Jones. So even though I had this long list of results for the name Nelson Taylor, I was able to find the bank record. Yet there are still additional records to acquire, but as you can see, there's 861 results. So I would need to reduce the number of results in order to make this search manageable. One of the things that you can do is play around with these filters here. These filters are lists of different record collections that all of your results are compiled from. And as you can see here, there are at least 3 that I could uncheck. This North Carolina database, the District of Columbia, and Virginia. And when I do that, it reduces the count down to 362 possible results. And I could even reduce this further if I were to click on the residence field and type Louisiana to restrict the search to just Louisiana records. But my experience has taught me that sometimes too many record collections will be hidden that you actually need to view. So how do we overcome this dilemma? Well, the answer lies in the 5th key to success that I mentioned earlier, using the Bureau's finding aids to help you locate the records more efficiently. What finding aids am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to a very specific and important document available to Freedmen's Bureau researchers, descriptive pamphlets. Descriptive pamphlets are the key to navigating these records, and without them, trust me, you will be lost. So at this point, I'm going to spend extensive time explaining what they are and how to use them to guide your way through these records. So just as discoveredfreedmen.org is a repository used to view Freedmen's Bureau records, here's another repository known as the Internet Archive. The difference between the two is the Internet Archive will view all of the rolls of film in a continuous fashion, page by page. So if you really want to understand how these books are laid out, I highly recommend the Internet Archive so that you can get proper context for how the records are organized. What this shows is that every microfilm reel within a publication contains a descriptive pamphlet at the beginning of the roll before you view the actual images of old documents. Now, any Louisiana researcher familiar with the Louisiana Field Office records knows that the microfilm publication number for Louisiana Field Office records is 1905. As you see here in the top right corner. For Mississippi, it's 1907. For Alabama and Arkansas, it's 1900 and 1901 respectively. And Virginia, it's 1913. Later in the presentation, I will discuss another valuable resource for Freedmen's Bureau records that lists all of the descriptive pamphlets for every state in one location for your convenience. But getting back to the Internet Archive, its image viewer provides these navigational tools at the bottom that allow you to view multiple pages or one page or two pages at a time. You can zoom in, zoom out, or go full screen if you'd like. But when it comes to the descriptive pamphlets, I can tell you, particularly for Louisiana, these descriptive pamphlets run anywhere from 118 to 120 images. So I know roughly how many images to scroll through to get to the beginning of the volumes. We see the cover of the volume right here, and if we click on the next image and then click on the two-page viewer icon shown here at the bottom right corner, we see the first few images of original documents created by the field office. But let's get back to the descriptive pamphlet. So descriptive pamphlets provide a wealth of information. They will provide information about the history of the Bureau, how it was organized in your state of interest, and it will also discuss in detail the operations of the Bureau in said state. They also provide descriptions of the records in their field offices. Here, for example, it says, all volumes were assigned numbers by the Adjutant General's Office, or AGO, of the War Department after the records came into its custody. In this microfilm publication, AGO numbers are shown in parentheses to aid in identifying the volumes. The National Archives assign the volume numbers that are not in parentheses. No numbers were assigned to series consisting of single volumes, and you will see examples of these later on in this presentation. The descriptive pamphlets will even tell you about related records and where you can find them. The field offices themselves, what cities or towns they were located in, and even give you a breakdown of the Bureau staff. But by far, the most critical information of interest to you in the descriptive pamphlets is the table of contents, which thoroughly details the volumes of record types on each roll of film and highlights the freedmen mentioned in them. For instance, here it describes registers of proceedings in Freedmen's Court and a name index that you can browse. Here it describes registers of complaints containing freedmen's names, their residence, and a summary of their complaint. And of course, there's more records, as I stated at the beginning of the presentation, such as hospital records, ration reports, military and marriage registers, and so forth. Now, this is one of the most popular and frequently searched records, the labor contracts, listed here as registers and payrolls of freedmen employed on plantations. For Louisiana, the records begin on roll 30, and as you can see here, it tells you which roll you can find your locality of interest. If I were to search for more records on Nelson Taylor, I would look on rolls 39 and 51, because sometimes the counties you are interested in may have split up the records over multiple rolls. So that's why it's important to read these descriptive pamphlets thoroughly. So, think of descriptive pamphlets as that flashlight you need in the dark areas to help you see where you're going. Okay, so now I want to show you something cool that Family Search does with the descriptive pamphlet to make it easier to navigate the records. And I will continue using case study number 2 on my 4th grade grandfather Nelson Taylor as my example. If you click search from the top menu and records from the sub menu, you will come to this screen right here. On the right side under find a collection, you can type the word freed or freedmen and pull up a list of Freedmen's Bureau collections. I'm going to choose the Louisiana Field Office records for this example. And it takes me to this screen right here. It gives you a detailed description of this collection, and if you want to know more about how to use this collection, I highly recommend clicking on this link here entitled How to Use This Collection. I won't go into it for the sake of time, but this link will open up the Family Search Wiki for this collection and provide great information about the content on each roll of film, examples of the record types, instructions for how to search and analyze the records, and more. But to get to the descriptive pamphlets for this collection, click this link here entitled Browse Through 97,119 Images. When you do that, you will see a screen like this. Now, it may not be apparent at first, but you are looking at the same table of contents that you see on the actual microfilmed descriptive pamphlet, but the contents are hyperlinked to the corresponding sections of the pamphlet. Well, how do I know that? Well, if you click here on descriptive pamphlet, you will see image 1 of the descriptive pamphlet just as you did in the Internet Archive. And similarly, if you click on this icon to view multiple documents, you can view the majority of the pamphlet and quickly navigate to any page you choose. Here, I chose to go to image 31 to view these details about roll 27 on the Subordinate Office and Plantation Department. It says, in July of 1865, a plantation department was created under the assistant commissioner to supervise black labor and enforce Bureau labor relations, which had been the primary function of the earlier Bureau of Free Labor. Well, this is referring to the formation of sharecropping and setting up the labor contracts between freedmen and former slaveholders that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. 2 images later, we see the table of contents on the labor contracts for each parish in Louisiana. Basically the same document that we saw in the Internet Archive. So again, when it comes to my ancestor Nelson Taylor, and I'm looking for him in West Feliciana Parish, I want to target roll 39 and roll 51. So now that I know where to find West Feliciana Parish labor contracts, I can go back to this screen, click on the hyperlinked version of this section entitled Subordinate Office Plantation Department, and now I can see all the rolls of film on labor contracts in every parish. And here you see rolls 39 and 51, but for our purposes, I'm gonna click on 51. And now you'll see a digitized microfilm reel of 51 on West Feliciana Parish labor contracts. So here you will see that there are 946 images to view, and that may seem time consuming, but look at it like this. Would you rather search 946 images in the target area of interest, or would you search 362 images that provide you little to no context of the area, the time frame, nor the associations of the target person, and provide no understanding of the purpose of the document that's being presented? So just understand that to understand in the enslaved, you really must understand community research. And the more you familiarize yourself with the history, the people, the slave owners and their families, and the places they live, the more that you will increase your chances of getting hits in these records. These images, page by page, piece by piece, will begin to tie together, and you will begin to see a bigger picture. And additionally, you will not miss names that weren't indexed or overlooked in your search results. You won't leave any stone unturned, and that we owe to our ancestors. So on image 453 of 946, we find the index card for labor contract number 76 at Mulberry Hill Plantation in West Feliciana Parish. The employer is P. Lebret, and the labor contract was established on January 1st, 1867. So here's the first page of the labor contract. You know, I'm fortunate that in this area of Louisiana, they frequently used this template for labor contracts, of course, which is easier to understand and read versus the handwritten contract like the one I showed you from Maryland and Sophronia Cooper. But here you'll see that Lebret's name is written as Pierre Lebret, along with the name of the plantation, Mulberry Hill. He also goes by the name Peter Lebret, which you will see in a few minutes. On the bottom half of the first page, you see a partial list of freedmen working for Lebret. So if we zoom in here, we see Nelson Taylor Jr., age 28, and I know it's hard to see his name because it's written on the folded part of the document. Just had to be my ancestor, right? But notice the name below, Dick Stafford. If you remember early on, I asked you to make a mental note of the name Richard Stafford on the 1870 census, living next door to Nelson Jr. The document on the left was recorded in 1867, and the document on the right was recorded just 3 years later. So the ages, although approximated, because rarely did formerly enslaved know their actual age, they match up fairly well. The other name that I asked you to make a mental note of was Wiley Jones. This is the second page of the contract, and if we zoom in from where the page begins at Dick Stafford's name, we see Wiley right here and 6 other names that I recognize based on prior research done years before. Jim Morgan, age 18, born around 1849. Luke Morgan, age 22, born around 1845. Cecile Bryant, age 35, born around 1832. And when we scroll further down from Wiley Jones, we see Francis Irvine, also known as Francis Irving, which is the same Francis that you see on the Freedmen's Bureau bank record early in the presentation. That is Nelson Taylor's sister. We also see Nelson's future wife, Martha Morgan, at age 15, born around 1852, who was also my third great grandmother. And they would be married 2 years later. And then also Martha's baby sister, Rosalie Morgan, who's age 12. At the bottom of the page, from Martha and Rosalie Morgan, we see that this contract was executed in the presence of an approver named L. Sterling. Well, I recognize that name from prior research. That's Colonel Lewis Sterling, owner of Wakefield Plantation and the former owner of Cecile Bryant, Wiley Jones, and the Morgans. Now, how do I know that? Because back in 2012, one of my cousins who descends from Cecile went to the Special Collections Department at Hill Memorial Library on Louisiana State University's campus and found this birth register of Negro slaves born at Wakefield Plantation. The register lists Martha Morgan, born in 1851, and her brother, Jim Morgan, born in 1847, both being the children of slaves known as Long George and Linda. Then there is Cecile, born in 1833, born of the same Linda, but not Long George. Notice the father's name is not mentioned. This indicates she is the half-sister of Martha Morgan. This was confirmed when several of my cousins who descend from Cecile took DNA tests with 23andMe and matched all of us who descend from Martha. Additionally, the birth years are within a 1 to 2 year approximation of the Freedmen's Bureau records, so I concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that these individuals on this labor contract are my relatives. A copy of the birth register was published in the book The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925, written by Herbert G. Gutman. As a family, we always encourage new relatives that we find out about to purchase the book to get a basic understanding of their lineage and how they relate to us. Earlier, I showed you the difficulty in name searching Nelson Taylor in the indexes on discoverfreedmen.org. Well, it's even worse searching Luke Morgan, because I could name search him and it'll pull up this contract and that's about it. If I name search his brother Jim, it won't show anything, which tells me that Jim wasn't even indexed for this record at all. Additionally, there are more documents pertaining to Luke and their older brother George Morgan that were not indexed at all. And that's why for the remainder of this presentation, I will be teaching you how to utilize my favorite tool, a website known as mappingthefreedmensbureau.com. And to do that, I will focus my final case study on Luke Morgan and their older brother George. Now, the co-founders for Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau are two nationally renowned genealogists and keynote speakers, Angela Walton Raji, who founded Afrogenius, and Maggie, the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute. And then there's also Tony Carrier, director of the Center for Family History and also founder of Low Country Africana, a nonprofit research project dedicated to African American genealogy. She also was a researcher on the PBS series African American Lives 2. Now, the purpose of this site is to plot all the locations of the institutions that served former slaves during Reconstruction on custom Google Maps. These institutions include some of the ones that we've already discussed, like the Freedmen's Bureau field offices, which are the most critical. And there's the branches of the Freedmen's Savings Bank as well. But it also includes freedmen schools, contraband camps, and battle sites where U.S. colored troops fought. And the image sources for those microfilm publications and those roles are the ones that we've been talking about throughout this presentation, the Internet Archive and Family Search. This is the landing page for Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau. And if you click on Research Guides in the navigational menu at the top, you come to this page here called Descriptive Pamphlets and Research Guides. Now, early in the presentation, you heard me say that there's a website where you can go to get all of the descriptive pamphlets for every state. Well, this is the website I was talking about. And if you look to the far left, you see all of the different states that were provided relief by the Freedmen's Bureau in the South. You know, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, etc. And if you click on each one of these, it will take you directly to that state's descriptive pamphlet where you could view and even download a copy. But more importantly, at the bottom here, you have this subtitle, Descriptive Pamphlets, In-Depth Guides to Each State. If you click that, you come to this page here that gives you in-depth information on what descriptive pamphlets are, the benefits of using them, the different record types and descriptions of the record types. I mean, basically everything that I've been covering in this presentation about descriptive pamphlets is well laid out here for you. And this is a great reference in case you ever forget all the things that I said. Now, if you click on this link in the navigational menu, Maps, you come to this page here that gives you a thumbnail image of a Google map that has all of these Freedmen's Bureau field offices plotted on the map. If you click on that map, you come to a screen like this, and this is where the fun really begins, because just like going to Google Maps to find locations that you're looking for, you can do the same thing here. The beauty of this website is they've plotted every field office, every contraband camp and battle site on this website, so that if you are targeting your person of interest in a particular area, you can just zoom in and zoom out and browse around here to find that field office in the location where your ancestors live that you believe may have served your ancestors. And so you have these navigational tools here on the side to help you zoom in and zoom out. So when I zoom in on the map, I go to the field office in St. Francisville, because St. Francisville is the parish seat for West Feliciana Parish. And remember, my final case study is based on my ancestors, Luke and George Morgan. And as you can see here, I get a message that tells me that in order to look at the field office records for St. Francisville, you must refer to Bayou Sara. And Bayou Sara happens to be the field office just behind that message. When I click on the Bayou Sara field office icon, it gives me information about the rolls of film that pertain to that particular parish. So that's what's wonderful about this map, is you can click on any field office and it'll tell you which microfilm rolls apply to that particular field office. So in my case, it's rolls 64, 65, 66, and 67. And for our purposes, we're going to focus on 64. And when you click on it, it opens up the Internet Archive, which you're obviously familiar with because I've been covering that throughout this presentation. So what you see here is it has clearly linked to the Internet Archive's microfilm publication of Roll 64. And you can tell in that URL at the top, it's giving you that unique identifier that lets you know which roll you're on. Secondly, when you scroll down further on the screen, you get more detailed information about the roll of film. You get the publication date and what the collection type is. It gives you information letting you know what reel of film you're viewing. And here at the bottom, you can, where I've highlighted where it's giving me the reels of film that pertain to Bayou Sara or, St. Francisville. And the bottom of the screen gives you the unique identifier that I just displayed in the URL of the website. And we've seen this screen before, which is just showing you the beginning of the microfilm reel and that its microfilm publication number is 1905. As I stated, for Louisiana, that would be the number for every roll that pertains to that state. When we move the slider in the bottom left corner, we're actually turning multiple pages. So I turn to the image 54, where I can then see a detailed description of Roll 64 in the descriptive pamphlet. Once we zoom in on the descriptive pamphlet, we see this detailed information about Roll 64. And one of the things that it explains are that there are these 2 volumes of registers of letters sent. in volumes 1 and 2, which are associated with AGO numbers 231 and 470. And we did read earlier about AGO numbers and what they stand for. Now, it talks about how these volumes of registers are then cross-referenced and linked to a case book in a singular volume of a register of complaints, which is in AGO 234. Now, if you look at the bottom there, you don't see 234 listed. And I know this gets a little bit confusing, but the whole point of showing you this is, as I stated earlier, this is your navigation through the records. This is how you get through them efficiently because it's guiding you. It's telling you where to go. But you don't see AGO number 234 on that previous page because what you see here is it's actually in roll 66, and it describes Register of Complaints, the single volume register of complaints from May of 1867 to August of 1868, arranged chronologically. So now I know that, okay, in roll 64, I've got a certain number of volumes that I need to view, but I also have to remember to go to roll 64 because there are associated records there. This is the beauty of the descriptive pamphlets. And this cover sheet shows you where in roll 64 the beginning of volume 1 begins. And when I turned to the very first page, I lucked out and found this record at the bottom right here about my ancestor George Morgan, who would have been my third great-grandmother's brother. And it actually states May 8th, 1867, case number 1, complaint made by George Morgan, freedman, against Peter Lebret. And we remember that name, also known as P. Lebret and Pierre Lebret. And it says see casebook, page 1, number 1. When I turn the page, I see another entry for Luke Morgan, George's brother. It says May 8th, case number 2, complaint made by Luke Morgan, freedman, against Peter Lebret, see casebook, page 1, number 2. So clearly the two brothers have now formally complained against the planter who they have a labor contract with. As I continue to read through these registers of letters sent in volume 1, I found this entry on May 11th. It says, investigated complaints against Mr. Peter Lebret by freedmen employed by him during the year 1866 in reference to their accounts and found they had been settled with justly. See casebook, page 1, numbers 1 and 2. So obviously it's referring to the same complaints by Luke and George Morgan. So this page describes several volumes that have the letters sent, and volume 4, AGO number 229, indicates that they also have a register of complaints dated January 1866 through May of 1867. So that's overlap for the complaints that Luke and George had submitted, and it says they're arranged numerically by case. The name index to letters sent in this volume also indexes the complaint. So I know when I get to that set of images, I'm going to see a name index, which could also even more easily refer me to different pages within that book once I look at the index. So now I'm going to go over to volume 4. And when I do, I find this here, which is one of the letters that was sent about George Morgan. And it says, case 106, Bayou Sara, Louisiana, March 27, 1867. And it says, George Morgan, freedman, complains that he worked last year for Mrs. Peter Lebret, that there were 20 hands on the place, that the hands worked for half the crop, that they made 64 box bales weighing from 400 to 450 pounds each. She has never paid us anything and says that we have taken up all that is coming to us. We cannot get her to settle with us. She says the cotton was sold at 32 cents per pound. She agreed to give my wife, Kitty, $4 a month extra for milking cows. She milked 3 cows. She never would tell us what she had taken up, but she said we would find it out at the end of the year. So obviously this is a complaint that George is saying, hey, we were supposed to be paid a certain amount and we have not been paid. And she's basically making excuses for not paying us. So let's refer back to volume 234, which refers to that case book that the descriptive pamphlet talked about, which was in roll 66. So here we are at the beginning of roll 66. And again, we have the cover sheet that shows you where the beginning of volume 234 begins. So again, we have additional notations on the complaints filed by George Morgan and Luke Morgan. And just as referred to earlier, we have case book 1 showing case number 1 and case number 2 for both of them. In George's case, it says George Morgan, freedman, has made complaint at this office that Peter Lebret wanted him to give his note for $140, that Lebret told him he was indebted to him that amount over and above what his share of the crop of 1866 came to. He says that he thinks he owes Mr. Lebret nothing. Then we have Luke's case where he says that he made a complaint at this office that Peter Lebret wanted him to give his note for $160. He stated that I and my family owed him that amount for supplies advanced last year and over and above what our share of the crop amounted to. I do not believe we owe him anything, but think that he owes us. So again, what you're seeing is what I was referring to in the beginning of my presentation, where you would have planters who were in contract with these freedmen, refusing to pay them wages, coming up with all kinds of excuses not to pay them, trying to take advantage of them because they're illiterate and think that they can't count. And so they're trying to find ways to still keep them as free labor. So I gotta say, after I saw the first couple of hits on Luke and George Morgan in volume 231, I had to spend a lot of time there. I remember spending almost my entire day in roll 231 because I figured if I could find this, there's probably a lot more juicy stuff in here, you know, on West Feliciana Parish citizens and what was going on in that time and day. And as I read through those registers of letters sent, I found this entry here, July 27th. And the description here is a little bit confusing, but what it's referring to is there were citizens, mainly white citizens, who filed a complaint to the Freedmen's Bureau over some type of communication sign that was provoking the Negroes of the community to assemble. And I think it was a concern for them. So they were trying to figure out what was going on. But what's fascinating about this description is it refers to a letter book. It says, see letter book page 5, number 86. Now, as much as I've talked about descriptive pamphlets and how they are that guiding light through the dark for you, the only thing that's better than a descriptive pamphlet is the actual document itself referring to other books or other pages. And so then looking at this, I know that I'm going to have to find this letter book within the collections of images and see where I can find that page 5 and that entry number 86. And here's where I found it. This is a fascinating report that I discovered that was written by, one of the field officers in the area who I think his last name was Finch. And, this speaks to the very things that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation about what types of reports that they would give on any uprisings or incidents of violence and things of that nature in communities. And so he's reporting here that several days ago, a number of citizens living near Laurel Hill called upon me and made a verbal statement that the Negroes in the neighborhood were in the habit of assembling at Laurel Hill every week with firearms and drilling. So you can imagine, this is a tense situation and he's trying to investigate this to figure out what's going on. He goes on to write, I would further state for your information that I have since made inquiries in relation to this matter and find that they doubtlessly did and still do meet with guns, pistols, and other arms, that they threw out their pickets and arrested all Negroes who refused to attend and would not let any white person pass their lines. But so far, there has been no disturbance or collision, and whether the alarm be well funded or not, I cannot presume to say. The excitement, however, continues, and the people claim they are in great danger and implore protection. and it's signed by A. Finch, who was one of the field officers there. Now, there's a final report that I found that I did not put in this presentation, but it referred to these quote unquote agitators who were instigating these events as radical Republicans that had provided bad advice and counsel to the freedmen. So when you really examine this, what we're talking about here is what was known at that time as the Negro militia. These were organized, they were really organized by radical Republicans during that time period in the South. And these Negro militias were a countermeasure in response to the violence and hostilities enacted by whites against blacks. You know, the Klan had continuously terrorized these newly formed black communities so they wouldn't, so that they wouldn't realize their political power. So these militias had attempted to create protective shields around vulnerable communities. And they were not only intimidating whites from harming Negroes, they were also pressuring the black people in the community to organize. That's why you see these arrests that were going on, that were being reported. They were arresting their own people, and they were trying to get them to understand their basic constitutional rights as newly freed people. All the things that I had mentioned earlier that white people were trying to suppress with the black codes. Like I mentioned earlier, the right to assembly, the right to bear arms, the right to exercise free speech, and so forth. So uncovering this kind of information really opened my eyes to the tensions and the climate of the times in communities where my ancestors first became free. These documents really tell a horrific story, showing the incredible stress and danger our ancestors were engulfed in. Well, I hope you found this tutorial enlightening and valuable, and I hope that it helps you achieve your objectives. I know I covered a lot of material, and I know it can be overwhelming. So if you feel like you need to watch this video again, by all means, feel free to do so. But what are the main points that we want to remember about this? Well, again, familiarize yourself with the record types. There are many different ways that I strongly recommend that you do this. You can review Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a great resource. I also encourage going to the Family Search Wiki, where you can read up on the different record types and how to analyze them. There's a lot of sources out there, including the descriptive pamphlet, to help you understand how these record types are organized, which brings me to this descriptive pamphlet. I know that I have probably said that word a million times and harped on that a lot in this presentation, and I can't stress it enough. It's really what orients you in these records, because it can be really daunting to try to find what you're looking for. And I know we all want to be able to just do a name search and just instantly pull up the record. Doesn't always work that way, particularly with African American genealogy. These records were not indexed completely, and so sometimes there's no way around it. I mean, think of it like this. If there's a favorite coffee shop or deli that you like to go to and it's downtown, and when you get down there you see that there's construction all around for a 2-block radius, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to park as close as you can, get out, and walk the rest of the way. And that's the same thing that you have to do with these Freedmen Bureau records. Okay, so when you can't find the results, like I said, try community-based research methods. One of the things that I talked about in this presentation was I studied census records ad nauseum. The birth register that I showed you that the plantation owner, where he documented the slaves who were born on his plantation, I studied those names ad nauseum. I tried to do everything I could to try to understand the associations of people within their communities, how they were all connected. And because the more I familiarized myself with that, when it came to looking at these records, I had at least a little bit of context to help me piece it together, and it made life much easier for me. That's why when I did have certain finds in the Freedmen's Bureau records, I was able to identify certain names and groups of people. Be sure to keep a log of the records you viewed, citations, and the dates you viewed them. Now, this is something I didn't cover during the presentation, But I cannot emphasize enough, as you can see, how voluminous these records are. I mean, we're talking millions of entries in these collections. And so you're going to want to organize yourself in order to save yourself some time and some heartache. Keep I don't care if it's a spreadsheet, but keep some kind of log where you're logging what collections you went through, the dates that uh, um, you reviewed them. Make sure you properly cite where those sources were, and maybe put a summary of what you found and who the target person was. Keep a record of that so that you're not going back looking at the same collection over and over and over again. That'll make someone want to quit. So, and we definitely don't want to see you do that. So hopefully, these tips will help you. And I thank you so much for taking the time to view my presentation, and good luck on your journey.